this symposium is coming out of the Faculty of Education, and it's part of the Year of Indigenous Education, which the Faculty of Education is marking. And the idea was to extend the Year of Indigenous Education beyond the Faculty of Education to the entire UBC. And the idea was to get non-indigenous scholars and administrators to speak to the issue of engaging indigeneity. And I asked people a number of questions. And in terms of the title of the symposium, one title could have been Working on the Edges of Indigeneity. We settled on We Too Are Idle No More to signal an awareness of the importance of the Idle No More movement. But this is not an Idle No More event, right? It is a UBC event. It is about scholarship. It is about how UBC is engaging with the issue of indigeneity, how well it's doing, who's involved, and what that looks like across campus. And I wanted us to open with the Faculty of Education, because that is so important, because this is where this originated. And it's been really good to have a panel on the humanities, a panel on community engagement, a panel on education just recently. And I want to close by looking at the university-wide situation. And for that, we are going to have a discussion of sorts. What's been interesting is that the ordinary panels have been quite traditional. You know, you have 3 presenters and a respondent. It's been interesting to do the plenaries because we didn't know what was going to happen. You don't tell senior administrators what they ought to do. Well, somebody should, but it won't be me. And so this morning we ended up with a wonderful discussion, at least I thought it was, between Blythe Frank and Joanne Archibald about what's happening in the Faculty of Education. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen this afternoon, but this is our final session, and we have 2 speakers that I know are very interesting people, so we're not going to be bored. And I'd like to introduce them. And again, the idea is to get a non-indigenous person and an indigenous person engaged in conversation about UBC's engagement with indigeneity. So our 2 speakers, first, there's Linc Kesler. Both of them might not need an introduction, but they're getting an introduction of sorts anyway. Linc Kesler is the director of the UBC First Nations House of Learning. He's also senior advisor to the president on Aboriginal affairs. And it's in the fact of these 2 roles that predominantly he's speaking today. He has been with the First Nations Studies program since its inception in 2003. He has designed and up to recently taught several courses in the program. He was the first chair of the First Nations Studies program. In 2008, he was co-chair for the UBC's Aboriginal Strategic Plan. In January 2009, he was appointed director of this house, the First Nations House of Learning. Linc has been involved with various FNSP initiatives, including the oral narratives, and the development of the interactive video transcript viewer and indigenous foundations. He was named the recipient of the Dean of Arts Award, amongst other things. There's a lot more I could go on about, but I think both Lynn and Anna want us to get on with it. So I'll turn to Dr. Anna Kindler, who is Vice Provost and Associate Vice President Academic, and she's also Professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy in the Faculty of Education. She received an MA in Industrial and Graphic Design from the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, Poland, followed by a second MA and a doctorate in Arts Education from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor Kesler joined UBC in 1990, and between 2001 and 2004, she was on leave from the university and served as Dean of the School of Creative Arts, Sciences and Technology at the Hong Kong Institute of Education. Professor Kesler has gained international recognition for her research in artistic development, social cognition of art, museum education, multiculturalism and cross-cultural research, and has published widely in those areas. So I want you to join me in giving a warm welcome to our final panelists for today, and I'll be around somewhere to kind of wing chairing this. So Linc and Anna.
I think I want to begin for both of us by just noting a couple of things that I think are very foundational circumstances. One of them is that the range of things that people bring to this entire area is really vast. From people who are knowledge keepers in their communities and spend most of their time in those locations, to people who are coming out of every discipline in the university and coming into relationship with this subject area maybe at the end of their careers. There's a whole range of people in between. And I think the second principle is that many of the issues that we are looking at and the relationships that are there for us to build are contentious. They are by nature contentious. And they're also contentious because to this point, we have not had many of the conversations we need to have. Or if we've had them only in preliminary form. And there's a lot to work out. But there are a lot of people who are interested, as you all are, in having these conversations. And there's a lot of intelligence and a lot of knowledge of all kinds to be brought in to developing really more productive approaches and better kinds of relationships through which what I think we're both convinced, and I'm sure all of you are, is some really important work to be done. So I think there's really a good potential here to do meaningful things with everybody, with what everyone brings into the situation. But it's going to take time and it's going to take work. And I'd like to begin my little piece of the comments here, and I know you guys have been at it all day. I've been checking on you every now and then when I come back from other things that I've had to do today. And I know you've been working really hard, so we're going to keep our remarks, I think, blissfully concise until we get to your questions, and then I'm sure we'll take as much time as we need. But I want to just begin by telling a couple of stories. Before I came to UBC, I worked about 400 miles south of here in the state of Oregon at the State University there. And when I arrived there from Toronto, where I'd done my graduate work, my office building was right next to the the American Indian Longhouse on that campus, which is a very small building in which there were very few people, and in which the people who were there were generally feeling extremely disenfranchised, and for the most part somewhat embittered. And we began working a little bit to try to put together a strategy to change the situation that was facing us. And we eventually evolved the first stage of that strategy. It took about 3 years, in which we began working to raise the profile of our small little community on campus. And I had, at one point, another colleague join in that. A very valuable Navajo colleague who was working in student services. And we began to put together a plan for how we would advance our circumstances at the university. And to tell you the truth, we were always looking for the ways in which we could move that strategy in what we felt was, in essence, opposition to the university. We were not getting any kind of response. And we were trying to create the circumstances of a greater level of visibility. We became part of a group that formed in the state that included the tribal education coordinators of the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. And we began to work with that community group and with some strategies internally to the university to begin to advocate for a greater level of attention to our needs and the needs of communities. We eventually established an office to address the needs of Indian students. And in the process of doing that, we were pretty much working as a very small group in positioning ourselves relative to the university. And when we began to broaden that group and include the community people who came in to help us, we began having a much higher rate of success with our efforts. We got to a point where we began advocating a little more generally and networking with other, what in the American context are the 4 traditionally underrepresented minority groups, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and American Indians and Alaskan Natives. And we began to form coalitions among the students and the 1 or 2 other faculty members who were available at the university. And that began to give us a much more substantial base. And we began, at that point, advocating for curricular change. And we were joined by some non-minority scholars and students in beginning to advocate for that curricular development. We were advocating to form a department, and we were advocating for that in an economic circumstance in which other departments were being closed. So this was not an easy thing to do. We had some circumstances along the way that were helpful and interesting, and I'd be glad to tell you more about this at some other time if you're at all interested in it. But we fought our way through, we defined a proposal, we had some support and encouragement to take it a little bit further, and we fought our way through committee after committee after committee. And some of those meetings in those committees were extremely contentious. I mean, people who were chairs of departments said things which I'm sure they lived to really regret because they were egregious in their racism. But we made it through. And we were at the point of taking it to the last committee, which was the University Curriculum Committee, before it would go to the Faculty Senate. So we walked into this room, and we sat down with the committee, and we really didn't know what to expect. And the chair of the committee was this guy who, truthfully, he was in this context anyway, a little intimidating. He was a fairly large man. He was a nuclear physicist and a real one. I mean, he went to Berkeley to head a nuclear physics lab not long after that. He had very short blonde hair that was kind of combed over on one side and black glasses. He looked like a guy who spent a lot of time in a lab. I mean, like he hadn't seen the sun in a while, and he had a pocket protector. And I mean, he was a serious looking guy. So it was my job to present the proposal to him, and I laid out, as concisely as I could, the kind of skeleton of it. And then he started asking questions on behalf of the committee, and they were very abrupt and very tough questions. So, da-da-da-da-da. And I said, oh, well, da-da-da-da-da. And he said, well, what about da-da-da-da-da? And again, the kind of rapidity of his approach was quite challenging. But I kept answering them. And after about 20 minutes, he folded up the folder that was on the desk, and he said, well, I think this is a really good proposal. You've completely convinced me, and I think we just have to take this to the Faculty Senate as quickly as we can. And I kind of, whoa, that's interesting. We eventually ended up on the floor of the Faculty Senate, and one of the things that happened there was in that meeting, a guy stood up at the front of the room, and he said, well, I know we're going to talk about this ethnic studies proposal today, and I just want to tell you that I've been, down at the state capitol campaigning for the university, and I told people we were going to be talking about this today, and they said, well, if you guys are going to be wasting your time with that kind of stuff, maybe we don't need to help you so much. So this was, really throwing down the dollar gauntlet, right? And I won't go into this part today, but we shook his hand at the end of the meeting because he did such a favor by being so clear in his opposition. But when it got time to present the proposal was presented not by me, but by Mr. Nuclear Physics. This guy got up there and gave the most succinct, clear, and forceful presentation of this proposal that we could have hoped for. He did it, truly much better than I would have. And the fact that it was him doing it rocked this entire room of people back on their feet. It's like, oh, so it's not just, those people who are here advocating for their thing. This guy actually thinks it all makes sense. And he's willing to say so. Whoa, this is very different. And we got a different level of consideration than we would have otherwise. Now, I'm not telling you it should have been like that. They should have had that reaction to me telling them about the proposal too. But in the politics of this situation, the fact that we were both there and that he was willing to lead off with that and that I answered the questions when they came off the floor after that really made a big difference. That proposal passed with almost no opposition. So, that was a pretty clear indication to me that there are points at which people willing to see a common value in the work that we're doing and willing to take a position on it really, really make a difference. When I came to UBC, I responded to an ad that I thought actually didn't indicate a whole lot of good faith, to tell you the truth, because it was to start a program that really wasn't there, and in which the requirements for the person to work in the program didn't seem to me to be particularly strongly worded. And I thought, well, what do they really want to do? So I came, and I'm looking at Marjorie here, who was running this search, and who I realized actually was a great person to work with. But I came, in part, quite skeptical of what I would find here. But what I also realized as I did some research behind this position was that though there was only one person who was an Indigenous faculty member in arts at that time, there were a group of scholars there who were quite remarkable and had done work which a lot of people respect, including a lot of American Indian people that I had contact with in the States. And that there would be the potential to have a kind of curricular base that was broader than simply one or two people. And that there would be a way to probably do something interesting with the program by adding in some other components to that availability. And really thinking, for instance, about the strategies of approaching knowledge and action as scholars and people trying to develop their skills, the skills that all of us were working on. And so I thought it was worth a try. And when I got here, I had a couple of really remarkable circumstances. The first thing that happened was I had a group of very militant students in the first couple of classes who were great. I mean, these were the students I wanted to work with for years, so it was fun most of the time. But they were encountering some serious challenges in some of the curriculum they were encountering in other departments. They were having some really great experiences, but they were having some really problematic ones as well. And one in particular problem that they were having was that there had been a really great faculty person in the history department, but he was getting to retirement, was not teaching his classes, and instead some sessionals were teaching them. And they were people who were Canadian history specialists who had not had the benefit of having any training in Indigenous history at all. So their presentation of Canadian history was not very satisfying to my students. So they came to me and indicated their dissatisfaction, and I said, okay, well, that was one department where there were some problems, and there were a couple of others as well. So I went to the heads of these various departments, and I said, some of the students are experiencing some real difficulties with the curriculum, and I'm wondering if we can talk about that. And, you know, I think that year there were maybe 3 departments, and in one of them I got really no meaningful response at all. And I won't embarrass them by mentioning who that was, but you can ask me later. But when I went to the history department, it was really, really interesting. I went into this, to the head's office, and he looked like a Canadian historian. He was a Canadian historian. And I thought, I don't know how this is going to go, but let's give it a try. So I told him what the issues were, and he said, I know, I've been really worried about this. I'm really glad to see you here. We've got to do something about it. And I thought, whoa, this is not quite what I expected. And we sat down and worked up a plan. A couple of years later, there were 2 new hires in Indigenous history in the history department. And for one of them, the department had one coming online from the retirement of that professor who was getting near the end of his term. But the other one was a position that they had in their department, which was not Indigenous history, that they were willing to divert to that purpose. So it was very interesting how that happened, because again, of course, if you know how universities work, nobody gets to just make decisions. I mean, a lot of things have to go through a process. So this culminated in a meeting of the Department of History where they would decide whether to go forward with this plan or not, and to try to do this. And again, when we went into that meeting, it was not me making the presentation. I was there. I was invited to be there, which I think mattered. But it was the head who made the presentation. And he made the presentation in a way that was really so convincing and so clear, and clearly had the support of some of the colleagues in his department. But I think really made a difference in the way a lot of other colleagues were seeing the logic of what he was proposing. And the result was that the department agreed with a very strong consensus to move forward in that way. And the result was a really good one, and gave us some superb colleagues to work with. So, once again, I mean, there are those moments where people commit themselves to a course of action which brings, I think, substantial benefit to widening the possibilities of having the discussions that we need to have, and addressing the profound levels of ignorance that exist in this country surrounding many issues that are important to all of us who are here today. You wouldn't be here if they weren't important to you. So I think there's a lot of potential in that process. I have to say that as well as some of those things went, things were not always so easy during that time, and I became convinced at one point that it was very important to begin working a little bit more on the university level, to think about how we were talking about these kinds of issues in order to have a little bit better platform for my program in the arts faculty. And I began getting a little bit more involved in some of those other kinds of meetings. Some of those meetings were very contentious at various points and very difficult. But in them, people emerged with strong and clear voices at critical moments that again affirmed my belief that it was possible to do things on a much more substantial basis. And I won't embarrass Anna at this point by mentioning her name in that context. That was a joke. I think I'm going to, in a second, turn this over to Anna to tell you and maybe make some remarks a little bit about the strategic planning process, because when Stephen Toop came to UBC, he indicated we were facing some very difficult budget decisions, and Stephen Toop wanted that process to be guided, I think, by some strategic planning instead of kind of reactive financial management. And he has a strong commitment to Indigenous issues and wanted those to be at the front end of the strategic planning process. So we formed, I think, a partnership in pursuit of doing that and seeing where we could go with it. And I think the result of that is many things that would not have been possible to embed in core university operations have been possible, and we've done our best to try to take advantage of those. But I also just want, before turning it over to Anna for a minute, to tell you, maybe I guess this is the fourth story. And the fourth story is that out of some of the things that I hope Anna will mention, we have become, as an institution, much more involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work and in the address of the Indian residential school history. And I think this has been a really interesting process. Anna and I at one point went to a day-long event that was on the North Shore and, on residential schools, and we sat next to each other. And I thought it was really interesting. We had conversations during the day. Anna, who grew up in Poland, totally out of the context of these issues. Me, whose mother went to a boarding school and have, I think, her experience there is half of the reason I'm here doing the work I'm doing, at least. And our reactions to it were very different, and yet we talked about issues of strategy coming out of that. Recently, we had a meeting here in this room after a long process by which UBC committed to suspending classes during the national event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on the 18th of September next year. And we were challenging a group of people to think about the ways in which they could participate in preparing the university for a meaningful engagement with that event. And we after that, we went away kind of not knowing what people were going to do. One of the faculty members, Rima Wilkes from sociology, gave me a call a couple of weeks later, and she said she was really concerned that faculty out in the departments really weren't tracking on this, and that it would slide off of their plates and nothing would happen. And what she decided she wanted to do is get together a group of faculty, and Marjorie was one of them, and there have been others, to go around to department meetings. And she felt absolutely unqualified to talk about residential school at all. She felt ignorant of it, but convinced that it was an important issue. And she was not going to those meetings to tell people anything about residential school. What she was going to tell them was that she, like them, was probably quite ignorant of what she was ignorant of these issues, as they probably were. And that there were things they could do, and there were ways in which they could engage in learning more and encouraging their students to learn more, and in which the window provided by the residential school understanding of that and by the TRC could be a way to begin engaging much more meaningfully with a part of history that they had no knowledge about. And she did this not to be nice to us, but because it's what she wants. It's working for the Canada and the university that she wants to see, that she wants to be part of. This got us into many department meetings around the university. I don't know if any of them were in education, but I think we made it to almost every department in arts. We've been to applied sciences, to dean's meetings, to the faculty of science, and people have been very receptive to it. They are aware that this is happening. They're aware of the fact that nothing in their history has given them a way to understand it. And there are many people who really want to work for that greater level of understanding. And that's the basis for building, I think, a much wider engagement with these issues here at the university. So again, I mean, that's the actions of one person who is not assuming she knows things, but is assuming that there's something that she can do.